What if you were in Pāpā'S place? Would you have the courage to tell your son the whole truth? Or would you choose silence to protect the only good image he has of his own father? Sometimes loving someone deeply means hiding certain pains. Not out of cowardice, but out of compassion. This story wasn't about a perfect hero, but about imperfect people trying to do right in the midst of chaos, secrets, and impossible choices. Rawiri made mistakes, but he had the courage to come back. And in the end, he left what might be the greatest legacy of all. The lesson that running away might seem easier, but facing what's right transforms the world around us. How many of us haven't thought about disappearing, vanishing, starting over from scratch? But does disappearing solve anything? Or does it just postpone the pain of those left behind? The silence of the funeral was torn apart by a piercing scream that cut through the stained glass windows of the wooden church in Whakatane. At the exact moment when the Rimu coffin was about to be sealed, little Tamakeahi, just 5 years old, dropped his toy from trembling hands and pointed with a shaking finger. "Daddy's alive!" He screamed with wide eyes, staring fixedly at the coffin as if he could see something no one else could see. The assembly of mourners froze. The air, for an instant, seemed to refuse to circulate. His maternal grandmother was the first to react. With flushed cheeks and a voice trembling with rage, she stood up abruptly. "This boy is disrespecting his father's soul. Someone get him out of here." The pastor hesitated. The funeral director went pale, and his mother, Panya Terangi, tried to hold back tears whilst pulling her son into her arms. But Tama fought back. He pointed to his ear. "I heard him knocking. He called my name, I swear." For a brief moment, even the crematorium worker stepped back half a pace. Doubt hung in the air like morning mist over Lake Rotorua. That's when the pastor decided to intervene. "We must continue, for the peace of the deceased." But before the seal could be closed, a mobile phone vibrated in one of the pews. It was the detective handling the body's release. She answered discreetly. What she heard from the Hamilton laboratory made her stand up with wide eyes and a choked voice. "We need to stop everything. The body might not be his." The church fell into absolute chaos. Elderly women began crying uncontrollably. Men started whispering amongst themselves, and children clung to their parents' legs. The funeral director, a pale man named Bruce Mackenzie, who had been working in Whakatane for over 20 years, had never experienced anything like this. His hands were shaking as he tried to process what was happening. "This is impossible," he muttered, looking at the official documents he had received 3 days earlier. The death certificate bore all the correct stamps. The identification had been confirmed by 3 different sources, and the family had formally recognized personal belongings found with the body. Panya felt the world spinning around her. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, choosing the white lilies that Rawiri loved, writing a speech she would never have the courage to deliver, explaining to Tama that Daddy had gone to be with the ancestors in the spiritual realm. She had held her son's tiny hand as he drew pictures of fish and boats to put in the coffin, believing these would help Daddy find his way home to the ocean he loved so much. Now, with her son still pointing at the coffin and repeating, "He's alive. He's alive," she didn't know whether to feel hope or terror. The Punamu pendant around her neck, passed down from her grandmother, felt heavier than ever. The detective, Inspector Sarah Thompson, a woman in her 40s who had seen enough cases to know when something wasn't right, approached the coffin with determination. She had been the one to call Panya 3 days ago with the devastating news, had been the one to explain how the body was found on the treacherous cliffs of Ohiwa Bay, battered by the rocks and the relentless Pacific waves. "I'm sorry, but we need to open this immediately. The DNA results from Hamilton show significant inconsistencies with the samples we have on file for Rawiri Terangi." The sound of the seal being broken echoed through the church like thunder rolling across the Bay of Plenty. Some people covered their eyes, others couldn't look away. Mrs. Aroha Terangi, Rawiri's mother, gripped her walking stick so tightly her knuckles went white. She had refused to believe her son was dead, had spent 3 days telling anyone who would listen that a mother knows when her child's spirit has truly departed. Tama stopped crying and watched with the serious expression that only children possess when they know something important is happening. His small fingers clutched a carved wooden whale that his father had made for him last Christmas. When the coffin lid was lifted, the silence was so complete that you could hear the wind whistling through the ancient kauri trees outside. The body inside was that of a man, yes, but the facial features, even considering the state of decomposition from 3 days in salt water, didn't perfectly match the photos of Rawiri Teirangi that were displayed around the church like a shrine to his memory. The ring with the initials RTR was there, glinting dully in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, but something felt profoundly wrong. The hands were wrong, too soft, without the calluses that decades of hauling fishing nets should have left. The build was similar, but not identical. Inspector Thompson looked at Panya and said softly, "Mrs. Teirangi, I think we need to have a very serious conversation. This changes everything we thought we knew." The body had been found 3 days earlier on a cliff face difficult to access in Ohiwa Bay, with an unrecognizable face and only a ring engraved with the initials RTR as an identification clue. The discovery had been made by a group of trampers who were exploring the coastal track early in the morning. They had called emergency services immediately, but by the time the rescue team reached the remote location, it was clear the man had been dead for at least 12 hours. Since Rawiri Teirangi was a well-known fisherman in the region and had been missing for 2 days, everyone assumed it was him. A preliminary report confirmed it. But now, a new DNA test showed inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. The mother of the deceased, who had never believed in her son's death, went pale at the back of the room. The collective mourning turned into a waiting room for a new kind of despair. The police officer who took the call, Constable Matthew Fatialofa, knew Rawiri's history better than most. A local boy himself, Matthew had grown up hearing stories about the Teirangi family's connection to the land and sea. Rawiri had been involved in heated conflicts with mining companies trying to exploit sacred tribal lands. He had filed numerous reports about the loss of native species in the Tarawera River, and had become something of a local environmental hero. But heroes, Matthew knew, often made powerful enemies. Doubt was growing in his mind. What if that body had been deliberately planted? Or worse, what if Rawiri was alive somewhere, hidden away, orchestrating everything for a greater purpose that none of them could yet understand? An employee of the mining company, Charlotte Harkness, was present at the funeral as a family friend, but she had begun to break into a cold sweat the moment the detective mentioned DNA inconsistencies. Charlotte was a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair always perfectly arranged and clothes that cost more than most families in Wakatane earned in a month. She worked for Meridian Extractors, the company that had been trying to secure mining rights in the region for over 2 years, facing constant opposition from environmental groups led by people like Rawiri. What no one in that church knew was that she had been having secret meetings with Rawiri for months, initially trying to convince him to withdraw his environmental complaints in exchange for a substantial sum of money, but gradually finding herself drawn into something much more complex and dangerous. As the coffin was cordoned off with police tape and carefully removed by the forensics team, Panya, still in shock and struggling to process what was happening, was gently guided to a quiet corner of the church by Inspector Thompson. The detective's voice was soft but urgent as she explained that they needed to ask some difficult questions. Beside his mother, Thomas sat quietly, with his eyes fixed on the wooden floor, his small fingers tracing patterns on his shorts. Suddenly he looked up and murmured, "He asked me not to tell, but I dreamed about the place where he is." The adults exchanged glances, not sure whether to take a 5-year-old's dream seriously, but something in the boy's tone made them listen. "Daddy is in a house that smells like the sea and sounds like birds, and there's a red stone in the yard." Inspector Thompson's eyes widened with recognition. She knew this place. Inspector Thompson had been born and raised in Opotiki, just 30 minutes from Wakatane along the coastal highway. As a child, she had played on the beaches where old fishermen gathered to mend their nets and tell stories. One story that had always stuck with her was about a young Maori man who had brought a special red stone from Rotorua to mark his favorite fishing spot, claiming it would bring him luck and protect his family from harm. The story was part of local folklore, and she knew exactly where that stone was located, at an old fisherman's cottage that had been abandoned for years. "Tama," she said, kneeling down to the boy's eye level and speaking in the gentle tone she reserved for child witnesses, "can you tell me more about this dream? What else did you see?" The boy looked at his mother, as if asking for permission to continue speaking about something that felt both secret and important. Panya, still trembling from the shock of the morning's revelations, nodded encouragingly. There was smoke coming from a little chimney, and Daddy was sitting on a wooden chair, but he looked very sad. He had a white bandage on his arm and kept looking at a photograph of me and Mummy. Charlotte, who had been listening to the conversation from what she thought was a safe distance, suddenly approached the group with quick, nervous steps. Perhaps the boy is confused with some old memory from when his father took him fishing, she suggested with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Children often mix reality with imagination when they're traumatized by loss, but her voice was shaking slightly, and Inspector Thompson, trained to notice such details, observed how Charlotte's hands were clenched into tight fists, and how she kept glancing toward the church exit as if planning an escape route. The detective led Panya and Tama to an old fisherman's cottage abandoned in Opatiki, where Rawiri used to spend his summers when he was young. The drive along the coastal road took 30 minutes, with Tama pressed against the window, watching the waves crash against the black volcanic rocks below. The cottage sat on a small bluff overlooking the Pacific, weathered gray by decades of salt spray and coastal storms. It was there, the red stone, an igneous rock that Rawiri had brought from Rotorua to mark the front of the yard, still stood like a sentinel guarding memories of better times. There were fresh footprints in the sandy soil around the property, and the remains of a campfire with ashes that were still warm to the touch. But the place was empty now, eerily so, as if whoever had been there had left in tremendous haste. Panya approached the cottage slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she climbed to the front door, which hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of salt, old wood, and something else, something familiar that made her breath catch in her throat. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into the main room. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. The furniture was covered with old sheets, but it was clear someone had been living here recently. There were signs everywhere. A half-eaten tin of beans on the kitchen counter, a damp towel hanging over the back of a chair, and most tellingly, a piece of clothing draped over the sink. She held the damp cloth against her face, breathing in deeply. It was his shirt. She would recognize Rawiri's scent anywhere in the world. The mixture of sea salt, tobacco, and the particular soap he always used was unmistakable. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as the reality hit her. Her husband had been here alive just hours ago, perhaps, but where was he now? And why had he put their family through this unimaginable ordeal? Inspector Thompson watched Panya's reaction with professional interest, but even her trained composure was shaken by the raw emotion she witnessed. Constable Matiu Fatialofa conducted a thorough search of the cottage while the others waited outside. Under a loose floorboard beneath the kitchen sink, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. A medical syringe with traces of a clear liquid, carefully wrapped in plastic. The substance inside had an unusual viscosity and a faint chemical smell that suggested it might be some kind of sedative or paralytic agent. Why would Rawiri need such a thing? Was he drugging himself, or had someone else been using it on him? The implications were disturbing, and Matiu carefully bagged the evidence for laboratory analysis. Charlotte, who had insisted on following them to the cottage, claiming she wanted to offer support during this difficult time, appeared at the property with suspicious timing. Her car engine was still warm when she arrived, and she seemed to know exactly where to park despite claiming she had never been to this location before. Her explanation that she had simply followed their route didn't quite ring true, especially when Inspector Thompson noticed that Charlotte's vehicle showed signs of having been driven on the rough coastal tracks recently. There was sand in the tire treads and salt spray on the windscreen that suggested multiple trips to this area. While the adults discussed their findings, Tama wandered around the cottage with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. Behind a pile of old fishing nets in what had once been a storage room, he discovered a weathered wooden box that had been hastily shoved under an old camp bed. Inside the box, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the coastal moisture, was a tablet computer. When Tama pressed the power button, the device came to life, still holding enough battery charge to function. On the screen was a partially recorded video message, and the face looking back at them was unmistakably Rawiri's, though he looked exhausted and frightened in a way none of them had ever seen before. His voice, when the recording began to play, was trembling with emotion and urgency. "If you're watching this, it means my choice has already passed the point of no return. They're going to try to erase me, but I need to stop what's coming. The mining rights, the sacred lands, the water table, it's all connected, and they'll destroy everything our people have protected for generations if I don't act." His eyes darted nervously off camera, as if he was afraid of being discovered. "Pania, my love, if you find this, know that everything I've done has been to protect you and Tama, but I may have made a terrible mistake." Before the recording could continue further, the tablet's screen flickered and went black. The battery had finally died, taking with it whatever final message Rawiri had been trying to leave for his family. Panya stared at the blank screen, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just heard. Her husband was alive, or had been when this recording was made, but he was clearly in danger and involved in something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. At that exact moment, the radio in Constable Mathieu's patrol car crackled to life with an urgent message that would change everything once again. Code 1 emergency. Shots fired near the coastal walking track, approximately 2 kilometers south of Opatiki. Adult male, serious injuries. Conscious and asking specifically for a child named Tama. Ambulance and backup units responding immediately. The voice of the dispatcher was tense and professional, but there was an underlying urgency that suggested this was no ordinary incident. Inspector Thompson looked at Panya, then at little Tama, who was still holding the dead tablet in his small hands. "We need to go, now." The cliff face was treacherous and steep, with the Tasman Sea battering violently against the jagged rocks below. Constable Mathieu arrived at the scene before the paramedics, his patrol car sliding slightly on the loose gravel as he braked hard at the edge of the coastal track. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his career. The man was lying crumpled among the native flax bushes and stunted Pohutukawa trees, breathing with obvious difficulty and pain. His shirt was soaked with blood from what appeared to be multiple wounds, and there were clear injection marks on his left arm that suggested he had been drugged. But despite the injuries, despite the pallor of his skin and the way his hands shook, there was no mistaking the face. It was him, Rawiri Terangi, very much alive, but fighting for every breath. Mathieu immediately called for the helicopter rescue team and began administering first aid. Though his training felt inadequate for the severity of the injuries he was seeing, Rawiri's eyes fluttered open for just a moment when he heard footsteps approaching, and when he saw little Tama running towards him down the narrow track, something changed in his expression. Despite the pain that was clearly racking his body, he tried to smile. It was a broken, desperate attempt at reassurance, but it was genuine. "Tama," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of waves crashing below. "My brave boy. I knew you'd find me." Panya reached her husband's side and collapsed to her knees on the rocky ground, not caring about the sharp stones cutting into her skin or the blood that was staining her clothes as she cradled his head in her lap. "Why, Rawiri? Why did you put us through this hell?" Her voice was a mixture of relief, anger, and desperate love. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the man she had mourned for 3 days, the man whose funeral they had been attending just hours before. "Why did you make our son believe his father was dead? Why did you let me grieve for you when you were hiding here all along?" Rawiri struggled to speak, each word clearly causing him pain. Blood flecked his lips as he tried to explain. They knew about the agreement, about what I'd discovered in their files. They needed my silence permanently, and I thought if I disappeared, if they believed I was dead, it would buy me time to gather evidence. But they found me anyway. His breathing became more labored as he continued. The water table tests, the sacred sites they want to destroy, the bribes to local officials. I have proof of everything. But Charlotte, she was supposed to help me expose them, not... He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence, while Panya comforted her husband and Tama sat quietly beside them, holding his father's bloodied hand with the fierce protectiveness that only a child can show. Constable Mathieu conducted a quick search of the immediate area. In Rawiri's backpack, which had been thrown clear when he fell, Mathieu discovered documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. There were photocopied contracts, detailed geological surveys, copies of emails between government officials and mining company executives, and most damning of all, bank transfer records showing substantial payments to local politicians and bureaucrats. At the center of it all was evidence of a secret agreement between Meridian extractors and certain members of the regional council to fast-track mining permits for areas that included sacred Maori burial grounds and environmentally protected wetlands. But the most shocking discovery was a series of text messages between Charlotte Harkness and someone identified only as CEO, messages that detailed a plan to eliminate Rawiri's opposition permanently. "Target has become too vocal," read one message dated just 2 days before Rawiri's disappearance. "Permanent solution authorized. Make it look accidental." Another message, sent the morning of Rawiri's supposed death, was even more chilling. "Body planted successfully. Local police convinced. Proceed with land acquisition immediately." As the rescue helicopter's rotors grew louder overhead, Rawiri gripped his son's hand tighter, and summoned the strength to speak one final, crucial message. "Tama, my son, listen to me carefully. In the red stone, behind the red stone at the cottage, there's a metal box buried in the ground. Inside that box is a memory stick with video recordings of everything. All the meetings, all the bribes, all the plans they have for our land." His breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, and the paramedics were already rappelling down from the helicopter. "Promise me you'll tell Mummy about the box. Promise me you won't let them destroy what our ancestors protected." Tama nodded solemnly, understanding with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess that this was the most important promise he would ever make. "I promise, Daddy, but you have to promise to get better so you can help us stop the bad people." Rawiri's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his son, this brave, perceptive little boy who had somehow known the truth when all the adults around him had been fooled. The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, establishing an IV line and preparing Rawiri for transport to Wakatane Hospital. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, one of the medics, an experienced woman named Jenny Patterson who had seen hundreds of trauma cases, shook her head grimly. "He's lost a lot of blood and there are signs of drug toxicity in his system. We need to get him to theater immediately." She looked at Panya with the kind of honest compassion that only comes from years of delivering difficult news to families. "I won't lie to you. The next few hours are critical. We're doing everything we can, but you should prepare yourself for any outcome." As the helicopter lifted off with Rawiri inside, Panya stood on the cliff edge with Tama in her arms, watching until the aircraft became just a distant speck against the gray sky. Below them, the waves continued their eternal assault on the rocks, indifferent to the human drama playing out above. But something had changed. The truth was finally beginning to emerge from the web of lies and deception that had trapped them all. Now they just had to pray that Rawiri would survive long enough to see justice done. Inspector Thompson put a gentle hand on Panya's shoulder. "We need to get that evidence to the authorities immediately, and we need to find Charlotte Harkness before she realizes how much we know." The chapter ends with the sound of the helicopter fading into the distance, and the ominous realization that their fight for truth and justice was just beginning. In the emergency department of Wakatani Hospital, Rawiri Teirangi fought against time itself. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his pale face as medical staff rushed around him, their urgent voices creating a symphony of controlled chaos. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, the chief surgeon, worked methodically to control the internal bleeding whilst Panya and Tama waited outside, holding hands in silence, their hearts suspended between hope and despair. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the underlying tension that permeated every corner of the trauma ward. Through the reinforced glass windows, they could see the medical team fighting to save the man who had already died once in their hearts. Constable Matiu Fatialofa, with the documents rescued from Rawiri's backpack spread across his desk at the police station, was beginning to piece together a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. But one particular document caught his attention. A birth certificate that made his blood run cold. The certificate was for a male child, born in Christchurch 28 years ago, with Charlotte Harkness listed in the field marked responsible guardian. This wasn't just about mining rights or environmental protection. This was personal family business that had been twisted into something dark and dangerous. The constable located Charlotte immediately, finding her sitting in the hospital car park inside her silver BMW, the engine running as if she was preparing to flee. Her laptop was open on the passenger seat, displaying what appeared to be flight booking websites and offshore banking interfaces. When Matiu approached her vehicle and tapped on the window, Charlotte's face went white with terror. She knew her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. With trembling hands, she slowly lowered the window, her perfectly applied makeup now streaked with tears she had been trying to hide. "Charlotte Harkness," Matiu said in his official voice, though his heart was pounding with the magnitude of what he was about to uncover. "I need you to come with me for questioning regarding the attempted murder of Rawiri Teirangi and conspiracy to commit fraud." But before she could respond, Charlotte's laptop chimed with an incoming video call. The screen showed an encrypted messaging application, and the caller ID simply read RTR, Rawiri Teirangi. Somehow from his hospital bed, barely conscious and fighting for his life, Rawiri had managed to access a pre-recorded message he had hidden in the cloud. Charlotte stared at the screen in horror as Rawiri's face appeared. But this wasn't the broken, bleeding man from the cliff. This recording had been made days earlier when he was still hiding at the cottage, planning his next move. His voice was steady and determined as he looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, it means they found me, and I'm probably fighting for my life right now. But I need everyone to know the truth about what happened, about why I agreed to disappear, and about the choice that brought us all to this point. In the recording, Rawiri sat in the cottage's main room, the red stone visible through the window behind him. His eyes were tired but resolute as he began his confession. 3 months ago, Meridian Extractors offered me something I thought I could never refuse. $2 million, a new identity in Queensland, all expenses paid for the rest of my life, and guaranteed safety for my family. All I had to do was withdraw my environmental objections and disappear permanently. They made it clear that if I refused, there would be consequences for people I loved. The recorded Rawiri paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that Panya would recognize anywhere. I said yes. I'm not proud of it, but I said yes because I was terrified of what they might do to Panya and Tama. Charlotte was supposed to be my contact, my way out, my protection. She arranged everything. The fake death, the planted body, even the funeral arrangements. We thought we had covered every detail. His voice began to crack with emotion as he continued. But then I discovered what they really planned to do with our land. With the sacred sites where my grandmother's bones rest. With the waterways that have sustained our people for centuries. Charlotte, still sitting in her car with Mathieu watching her every move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. On the recording, Rawiri's expression had hardened with determination. I found the real contracts, the environmental impact studies they had hidden, the bribes to government officials. They weren't just planning to mine the land. They were planning to poison it permanently. The chemicals they intended to use would contaminate the entire watershed, making it uninhabitable for generations. I couldn't live with that knowledge, even if it meant breaking my agreement with them. The recording continued with Rawiri looking directly into the camera, as if he could see through time to this exact moment. Charlotte, if you're watching this, I know you tried to protect me initially. I know you believed their promises just as much as I did. But when I told you I wanted to expose everything, when I said I couldn't go through with the plan, you had a choice to make. You could have helped me do the right thing, or you could have chosen to protect yourself and your career. His voice became softer, almost sad. I hope you made the right choice. I hope you're helping my family understand why their husband and father had to become a ghost in order to save their future. But then Rawiri's expression changed, becoming urgent and frightened. If you're watching this and I'm not there to explain it myself, it means Charlotte chose differently. It means she told them I was going to expose everything, and they sent someone to silence me permanently. The injection marks on my arm, the chase through the bush, the fall from the cliff, none of that was an accident. They tried to make my fake death into a real one. At that moment in the recording, sounds could be heard outside the cottage. Car doors slamming, voices shouting, footsteps on the wooden porch. Rawiri's eyes went wide with fear as he quickly moved to hide the laptop. "They've found me," he whispered urgently into the camera. "Panya, my love, if something happens to me, remember that everything I did was to protect you and our son. Tell Tama that his father fought for what was right, even when he was scared. And tell him." The recording cut off abruptly as the cottage door burst open. Charlotte finally looked up at Constable Mathieu, tears streaming down her face, her career and her life in ruins around her. "He was going to destroy everything," she said in a broken voice. "The company, my job, the development that would have brought hundreds of jobs to the region. I thought if he just stayed hidden, if he just kept quiet, everyone could have what they wanted." She paused, struggling with the weight of her confession. "But when he said he was going to expose everything, when he threatened to upload those files to the media, I told them where he was hiding. I never thought they would try to kill him. I thought they would just convince him to reconsider." Mathieu felt a mixture of disgust and pity as he looked at this woman who had helped orchestrate such elaborate deception and betrayal. "Charlotte Harkness, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and accessory to attempted homicide." As he read her rights, his radio crackled with urgent news from the hospital. "Constable Fatilofa, you need to get here immediately. The patient is awake and asking for his family, but the doctors say we might only have minutes." With Rawiri unconscious and his survival uncertain, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on the hospital like a physical force. The intensive care unit hummed with the constant sound of machines monitoring his vital signs, each beep a fragile reminder that life hung by the thinnest of threads. Panya sat beside his bed, holding his bandaged hand, whispering prayers in both English and Tereo Maori. calling on the ancestors to guide her husband back to the land of the living. Little Tama curled up in the chair beside her, clutching the wooden whale his father had carved, his young mind struggling to process the roller coaster of emotions from the past few days. It was then that one of the nurses, a kind woman named Margaret Thompson who had been working at Wakatani Hospital for over 20 years, made a discovery that would change everything once again. While cataloging Rawiri's personal effects, she found something unusual sewn into the inner sole of his worn fishing boots. A small USB drive, waterproofed and carefully concealed. The discovery was immediately reported to Constable Mathieu, who was still processing Charlotte's arrest and trying to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the Teirangi family. The USB drive contained a second video recording, this one obviously made several days before the dramatic events at the cliff. In this recording, Rawiri appeared calmer, more thoughtful, sitting in the cottage's main room with afternoon sunlight streaming through the salt-stained windows. On the small table beside him sat the carved wooden whale that Tama had made for him the previous Christmas, a child's attempt at recreating the creatures his father loved so much. Rawiri picked up the toy and held it gently in his weathered hands as he began to speak. "My son," he said, looking directly into the camera with the kind of intensity that only comes from a parent trying to communicate something vital to their child. "If you're watching this video, it means that something has happened to your father, and I won't be there to explain why I made the choices I made. I want you to know that everything I did, the lying, the hiding, the fake death that put you and your mother through such pain, everything was because I love you more than my own life, and I was trying to protect your future." In the recording, Rawiri's voice was steady but filled with emotion as he continued his message to his son. "When you were born, Tama, I held you in my arms and made a promise to the ancestors that I would leave you a world that was better than the one I inherited. I promised that the waters would still run clean when you had children of your own, that the sacred places where your great-grandmother's bones rest would still be protected, that the fish would still fill the nets when you became a man." He paused, looking down at the wooden whale in his hands. "I thought I could keep that promise by taking their money and disappearing. I thought that if I just stayed quiet, if I just went away, they would leave our land alone." The camera captured every detail of Rawiri's expression as shame and regret washed over his features. "But I was wrong, son. I was weak, and I was wrong. When I saw their real plans, when I discovered that they intended to poison the entire watershed with their mining chemicals, when I realized that taking their money would mean betraying not just my own principles, but the trust of every generation that came before us, I knew I had to come back. I knew I had to fight, even if it meant risking everything." Rawiri stood up in the recording and walked to the window, looking out at the red stone that marked the boundary of the property. "My heritage, my inheritance to you, isn't money, son. It's not the house or the boat or any material thing. My inheritance to you is the responsibility to protect what we love, to stand up for what's right even when we're frightened, and to understand that running away from our problems never makes them disappear. It just makes them someone else's burden to bear." He turned back to the camera and tears were visible in his eyes. "If this story reaches its end, if you're watching this because your father is gone, I want it to serve as a lesson. Disappearing is never the solution. Facing the truth, standing up and fighting for what's right, that's the only path that leads to real peace." As Pania watched the recording with Tama curled against her side, both of them crying at this final message from the man they loved, she felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak that was almost too intense to bear. Here was her husband, flawed and human and terribly afraid, but ultimately choosing courage over comfort, choosing to protect his family's future even at the cost of his own safety. The man in the video was the Rawiri she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who would rather die fighting than live with the knowledge that he had betrayed his own people. Meanwhile, Constable Mathieu had ensured that the video reached the proper authorities and, within hours, it began spreading across social media platforms throughout New Zealand. The story of the fisherman who faked his death to save his tribe captured the public imagination in a way that few stories ever do. People from Auckland to Invercargill shared the video, commented with their own stories of environmental activism and corporate corruption, and flooded the Teirangi family with messages of support. The hashtag, Justice for Rawiri, began trending nationally, and environmental groups across the country rallied to demand a full investigation into Meridian Extractor's activities. The government, facing mounting public pressure and undeniable evidence of corruption within their own ranks, announced a formal inquiry into the illegal mining contracts. Charlotte Harkness was formally charged with conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to attempted murder, though during her arraignment she broke down completely and begged to be allowed to testify against her former employers in exchange for a reduced sentence. Several high-ranking officials from both the regional council and the mining company were arrested in dawn raids. Their computers and files seized as evidence of the extensive bribery and corruption that had nearly succeeded in destroying the Tewakata tribal lands. But inside the hospital room, away from the media attention and public outrage, a more personal drama was unfolding. Rawiri's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he remained unconscious, his body fighting to recover from the trauma and the drugs that had been forced into his system. The doctors couldn't say when or if he would wake up. Panya faced an agonizing decision about how much of the truth to share with the world, and more importantly, how much to share with Tama when he was old enough to understand the full complexity of what his father had done. That evening, as the sun set over the Bay of Plenty and the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, Panya made a choice that would define how their family's story would be remembered. She called Constable Mathieu to her side and said quietly, "I want to hold a press conference tomorrow, not to make Rawiri into a hero he doesn't think he is, but to tell the truth about what ordinary people will do when they're pushed too far, when they're forced to choose between their own safety and the future of everything they love." She looked down at Tama, who had finally fallen asleep in the hospital chair, still clutching his father's wooden whale. "And I want to make sure that when my son grows up, he understands that his father came back not because he was fearless, but because love is stronger than fear, and sometimes that's enough to change the world." 2 days later, Rawiri awoke from his medically induced coma. But the man who opened his eyes was not the same person who had fallen from that cliff. The traumatic brain injury from his fall, combined with the toxic effects of the drugs that had been forced into his system, had left him with significant cognitive impairment. He could recognize faces, could understand simple conversations, but the eloquent environmental activist who had once commanded town hall meetings and government hearings was gone. His speech was halting and confused, his memory fragmented like broken glass reflecting distorted images of the past. When he looked at Tama, his eyes filled with love and recognition, but when he tried to speak, the words came out jumbled and incomplete. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, the neurologist overseeing his care, explained the situation to Panya with the gentle professionalism that comes from years of delivering life-changing news to families. "The damage is significant, but not necessarily permanent," she said, studying the brain scans that showed areas of swelling and trauma. "With intensive therapy, he may recover much of his cognitive function, but it will take months, possibly years. His long-term memory seems largely intact, but his ability to form new memories and express complex thoughts has been severely compromised." She paused, watching Panya's face as the full implications sank in. "He remembers loving you and Tama. He remembers his connection to the land and his people, but the sophisticated understanding of the conspiracy, his ability to testify in court or speak to the media, that may never return." Outside the hospital, a vigil had formed that seemed to grow larger every hour. Members of the Tewakata Iwi had come from across the North Island, bringing with them traditional weavings, carved taionga, and food to sustain the family through their ordeal. Elder women sang wayata that drifted through the hospital corridors, their voices carrying ancient melodies that seemed to reach into the intensive care unit itself. Children from the local schools had made cards and drawings, many depicting Rawiri as a warrior protecting a stylized landscape of mountains and rivers. The media presence was overwhelming. News crews from Auckland, Wellington, and even Australia had descended on the small coastal town, turning the hospital car park into a maze of satellite trucks and cameras. The government's response had been swift and dramatic. Prime Minister Helen Richardson announced a comprehensive review of all mining permits in environmentally sensitive areas, whilst the Minister for Maori Affairs promised that no sacred sites would be disturbed without explicit consent from the affected IWE. Meridian Extractor's assets had been frozen pending the criminal investigation, and several company executives had been arrested in coordinated raids across the country. Charlotte Harkness, facing decades in prison, had agreed to testify against her former employers in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing investigators with detailed information about the bribery networks that had facilitated the illegal mining contracts. But inside room 237 of Wakatani Hospital, these political victories felt hollow and distant. Panya sat beside her husband's bed, holding his hand, and trying to process the cruel irony of their situation. Rawiri had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, had risked his life to protect his people's land, and had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But he would never fully understand the impact of his actions. When she tried to explain to him that the mining project had been stopped, that the corrupt officials had been arrested, that their fight had been won, he smiled and nodded. But she could see that the concepts were too complex for his damaged brain to fully grasp. Tama, with the adaptability that children possess in the face of unimaginable change, had appointed himself as his father's protector and translator. When visitors came to the hospital room, when journalists tried to ask Rawiri questions that he couldn't answer, Tama would step forward with surprising maturity and explain that his daddy was still getting better and needed time to rest. The 5-year-old boy who had screamed about his father being alive at the funeral had become the guardian of his father's dignity, ensuring that the man who had saved their land wouldn't be reduced to a spectacle for public consumption. The decision about how to handle the media attention fell to Panya, and it was perhaps the most difficult choice she had ever faced. The public was hungry for a hero story, desperate to hear from the brave fisherman who had taken on corporate corruption and government betrayal. Documentary filmmakers were offering substantial sums for exclusive access. Publishers wanted book rights, and politicians were eager to associate themselves with Rawiri's cause. But the man himself could barely string together a coherent sentence, could no longer remember the details of his own heroic actions, and became agitated and confused when confronted with crowds or cameras. Dr. Mackenzie had also shared another devastating piece of news during a private consultation with Panya. The toxic substances that had been injected into Rawiri's system weren't just sedatives. They included experimental compounds that the mining company had been using to pacify environmental protesters in other countries. The long-term effects were unknown, but preliminary tests suggested that his cognitive impairment might be progressive, that the man she loved might continue to slip away from her even as his body healed. "We're in uncharted territory," the doctor admitted. "The combination of traumatic brain injury and chemical poisoning creates a situation we've never encountered before. He could stabilize at his current level of function. He could improve significantly." Or, she didn't need to finish the sentence. That evening, as the sun set over the Bay of Plenty and painted the hospital walls in shades of gold and crimson, Panya made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. She called Constable Mathieu and Inspector Thompson to a meeting in the hospital chapel, a small interfaith space where patients' families often came to pray or simply find a moment of peace. "I've decided," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "that we're going to tell the world that Rawiri is recovering well, that he's chosen to step back from public life to focus on his family and his healing. We're not going to parade him in front of cameras or exploit his condition for political gain." Mathieu looked puzzled. "But Panya, the public has a right to know what happened to him. His story has inspired people across the country. It's brought about real change. Doesn't he deserve recognition for what he accomplished?" Panya shook her head slowly, looking through the chapel window towards the room where her husband lay sleeping, where Tama was curled up in a chair beside the bed, still clutching that wooden whale. "The recognition he deserves is a chance to live with dignity, to be remembered as the man who saved our land, not as the victim who lost his mind doing it. Sometimes protecting someone you love means making choices they can't make for themselves." Inspector Thompson, who had seen enough cases to understand the weight of such decisions, nodded slowly. "What do you need from us?" Panya took a deep breath before answering. "I need you to help me create a narrative that honors what he did without exploiting what he's become. I need the media to understand that heroes don't always get fairy tale endings, but that doesn't make their sacrifices any less meaningful. And I need time. Time for him to heal as much as he can. Time for Tama to grow up with a father who's present even if he's not perfect. Time for our family to find a new way to be whole." As they spoke, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Tama's voice could be heard, high and clear and urgent, calling for his mother. They rushed back to Rawiri's room to find him sitting up in bed, more alert than he had been since awakening from the coma. His eyes were focused and intense as he looked at Panya, and when he spoke, his words were clearer than they had been in days. "I remember," he said, his voice filled with wonder and recognition. "I remember why I came back. I remember what we fought for." But even as hope began to bloom in Panya's heart, she could see the confusion already creeping back into his expression, the moment of clarity fading like morning mist over the harbor. It was then that Rawiri did something that broke her heart and filled it simultaneously. He reached for Tama's hand and with tremendous effort, managed to speak the words that would become his legacy. "Promise me," he said to his son, "that you'll tell people that your father came back because love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes that's enough to change everything." Tama nodded solemnly, understanding that this was another sacred promise, another responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. 6 months later, the hospital allowed Rawiri to record one final video message. Not the articulate environmental activist who had once commanded government hearings, but a man speaking from the heart with simple, profound truth. The recording took place in the hospital's family room, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the very waters he had fought to protect. His speech was slower now, sometimes halting as he searched for words that used to come easily, but his message was crystal clear. "I am not a hero," he said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held both pain and peace. "I am just a man who made mistakes trying to protect what he loved most. If any child watches this someday, I hope they understand. Running away never solves anything. Facing the truth, standing up for what's right even when you're frightened, that's the only path that leads to real change." At the end of the video, something remarkable happened. Rawiri began to cry, the first time he had shown such deep emotion since his cognitive abilities had been damaged. But these weren't tears of sadness or frustration. As Tama climbed onto his lap and wrapped small arms around his father's neck, Rawiri smiled through his tears and said, "I knew you would find me, my brave boy. I heard you calling my name, even when I was lost." The moment was captured on camera, a father and son reconnecting across the chasm that trauma had created between them. Love bridging the gap that medicine couldn't heal. Panya made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than seeking maximum media exposure or pursuing the substantial financial compensation that was available from the mining company's settlement fund, she chose a different path entirely. Using a portion of the compensation money, she established the Teirangi Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing educational scholarships for both Maori and Pākehā children in the Bay of Plenty region. The foundation would focus on environmental science, indigenous rights law, and sustainable development, ensuring that the next generation would be better equipped to protect their heritage than their parents had been. Rawiri, despite his limitations, became involved in the foundation's work in ways that surprised his doctors and inspired his community. Unable to deliver complex speeches or navigate bureaucratic processes, he instead worked directly with children at local schools, using simple stories and hands-on activities to teach them about caring for the environment. His damaged brain seemed to connect naturally with young minds, and children who might have been intimidated by the eloquent activist were drawn to the gentle man who spoke their language. He would take them to the shores of Ohiwa Bay, show them how to read the health of a waterway by observing the insects and fish that lived there, and tell them stories about the ancestors who had protected these places for centuries. Charlotte Harkness, facing the full weight of her actions, made an unexpected request during her sentencing hearing. Instead of accepting the plea bargain that would have reduced her prison time, she asked the judge to allow her to serve her sentence through community service, specifically working with the Teirangi Foundation to help repair the damage she had helped cause. "I can't undo what I did," she said, addressing the court with tears streaming down her face, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure that other communities don't face the same threats, that other families don't have to make the impossible choices that Rawiri made." Panya, in a gesture that shocked the courtroom and the media, stood up and supported Charlotte's request. "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption," she said. "If Charlotte wants to spend her life teaching others not to make her mistakes, then that's a punishment that creates something positive from something terrible." The legal and political ramifications of the case continued to ripple outward for years. The Meridian Extractors scandal led to a complete overhaul of New Zealand's mining regulations, with new laws requiring Indigenous consent for any development on traditional lands. Several politicians lost their careers, and the case became a landmark in environmental law not just in New Zealand but internationally. Universities studied the Teirangi case as an example of how grassroots activism could challenge corporate power, and Rawiri's story was taught in law schools as a case study in environmental justice and the protection of Indigenous rights. But perhaps the most profound legacy was one that wouldn't be fully understood for many years. Tama Teirangi, the 5-year-old boy who had disrupted his father's funeral with his insistence that daddy's alive, grew up with a unique understanding of truth, courage, and the complexity of human nature. His childhood was shaped by watching his father struggle with disability while maintaining dignity, by seeing his mother balance fierce protection of their family with generous forgiveness of those who had wronged them, and by learning that heroes aren't perfect people who never make mistakes. They're ordinary people who find the strength to do the right thing when it matters most. 24 years later, Dr. Tama Teirangi stood before the United Nations Environmental Council in Geneva, delivering a keynote address on indigenous rights and environmental protection. In his speech, he talked about his father, not as a mythical hero, but as a flawed human being who had made terrible mistakes and then found the courage to correct them. "My father taught me that disappearing from your problems never makes them go away," he said to the assembled delegates from around the world. "Running away just makes the problems someone else's burden to bear. But when we find the courage to face the truth, when we choose to stand up for what we believe in despite our fear, we can change not just our own lives, but the lives of generations yet to come." The speech was broadcast live across New Zealand, where Pania, now in her 60s, watched from the cottage in Opatiki, the same cottage where Rawiri had hidden all those years ago. Beside her sat an elderly man in a wheelchair, his hair white and his speech still halting, but his eyes bright with pride as he watched his son speak to the world. Rawiri's cognitive abilities had never fully returned, but his capacity for love, for wonder, for finding joy in simple moments had remained intact. He still couldn't remember complex political theories or navigate bureaucratic systems, but he could remember every story Tama had told him about his work, every achievement his son had accomplished, every moment of pride they had shared together. At the end of Tama's speech, the camera focused on his final words, which were spoken not to the UN delegates but directly to the camera, as if he could see through the screen to the cottage where his parents were watching. "This story isn't really about heroes and villains, about good triumphing over evil. It's about real people making difficult choices, about the price we pay for standing up for what we believe in, and about the fact that sometimes love really is stronger than fear." If you're watching this and facing your own impossible choice, remember that running away might seem easier, but staying and fighting for what's right, that's what transforms the world around us. The final image of the documentary that was made about the Teirangi family showed 3 generations sitting together on the shore near the red stone. Rawiri in his wheelchair, still gentle and confused but surrounded by love. Panya, her hair streaked with gray but her eyes still fierce with the determination that had carried them through their darkest days. And Tama's own children, playing in the sand where their grandfather had once hidden, learning stories about courage and redemption that would shape their understanding of what it means to be human. As the camera pulled back to show the pristine waters of Ohiwa Bay, still clean and protected thanks to one man's decision to stop running and start fighting, viewers were left with a final question that echoed long after the credits rolled. If you had the chance to disappear to protect those you love, would you run away or would you stay and fight? And if you stayed, would you have the courage to face the consequences of choosing love over fear, truth over comfort, hope over despair? What would you have done if you were Rawiri? Would you have taken the money and disappeared to protect your family? Or would you have stayed to fight from the beginning? And if you were Panya, facing a husband who survived but was forever changed, would you have chosen truth or protective silence? These aren't just questions about fictional characters. They're questions about the choices we all face when love collides with fear, when doing right means risking everything we hold dear. This story reminds us that heroes aren't the people who never fall. They're the ones who find the strength to get back up, even when the cost is everything they once were. Rawiri lost his voice, his memory, his brilliant mind, but he gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that his son would grow up in a world where the waters still run clean, where sacred places remain protected, where one man's courage to stop running changed the course of history. Sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices, and sometimes love really is stronger than fear. If this story touched your heart, if it made you question what you would do when faced with impossible choices, then it's done what all true stories should do. It's held up a mirror to your own soul. Share this with someone who needs to hear that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. Follow our channel for more stories that don't just entertain, but transform the way you see the world around you. Because sometimes, just sometimes, one story can change everything, including you.